My name is Matt Plen, and I want to talk about Gershom Scholem, the most important academic scholar of Jewish mysticism. Scholem was born in 1897. He lived till 1982. He came from a middle-class, patriotic and acculturated German Jewish family. You can see a picture of him here in my very high-tech presentation. Now, Scholem grew up in that kind of bourgeois German family, but he rebelled. He became a Zionist. He was expelled from school for circulating anti-war propaganda and was cut off by his father. And in 1923, he made Aliyah. He threw himself into Jewish learning and scholarship of all kinds. He was influenced by Buber. He was friends with Walter Benjamin and with Shai Agnon. He eventually became a professor at the Hebrew University. Now, he wasn't a typical Zionist either, and rebelliousness seemed to mark every phase of his life. He was what we might call a radical or an anarchist Zionist. He was involved with Martin Buber and others, for example, in setting up Brit Shalom, which was the first Jewish-Arab peace movement. And he was always opposed to militaristic, hyper-nationalist expressions of Zionism. Now, until the early or mid part of the 20th century, Jewish scholarship had always been very rationalistic. And the original Jewish scholars of the 19th century had emphasized the universal rational elements of Jewish culture and literature. So they'd gone through the tradition and combed through the Bible and the Talmudic literature, Jewish philosophy, to explore and emphasize what they saw as the universalist, rationalist ideas that could be found in those texts. Anything that didn't fit that mold, they had tended to ignore or suppress as things which were slightly embarrassing to a modern European Jewish mindset. Now, Scholem fell in love with a whole range of Jewish literature, including those bits which had previously been suppressed. And for example, he wrote a doctorate on the 13th century book, the Sefer HaBahir, which was a key mystical text. And from there, he embarked on a study of Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, about which hardly anything had been written. Now, he used the tools of philology, in other words, the historical and linguistic study of texts, to unearth and catalogue and analyse a previously entirely neglected world of literature. And in so doing, he created a whole new academic field. One example, the Zohar. So the Zohar is the core text of Kabbalah, and it consists mainly of a series of kind of midrashim and drashot on texts from the Torah, which reveal mystical truths. Now, it was traditionally considered to have been written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the Mishnaic period, 2,000 years ago. Through textual analysis, Scholem showed that that couldn't be true. For example, he noticed idiosyncrasies in the text use of Aramaic. He noticed certain Spanish linguistic influences, and he also noticed that the author of the text lacked a detailed knowledge of the geography of the land of Israel, which anyone living there at the time would have had. Scholem concluded that in fact the Zohar was a 13th century text written in Spain by a character called Moshe de Leon. Subsequent scholars have cast doubt on that theory, and they've gone on to do further analysis, but the idea of Kabbalah as a legitimate subject of academic study was firmly established. Now, there's an interesting anecdote which is told about Scholem, and this is a version recorded by Cynthia Ozick in a very interesting article about Scholem in the New Yorker magazine. You can Google it and find it easily online. And she says, she relates the story like this. She says, "It may have been in the early 1940s, there are no living witnesses, and no one of the current generation is certain just when, that Scholem was invited to New York to deliver a lecture on Kabbalah at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He was introduced by Saul Lieberman, a leading Talmudic eminence, and thereby an adherent of Jewish rationalism. Nonsense is nonsense, Professor Lieberman pronounced, but the history of nonsense is scholarship. Whether Scholem responded to this now legendary maxim is not known, but the immensity and the passion of his scholarship intimates that he did not include visionary symbolism among the artifacts of nonsense," end quote. And so what we can see is that actually, as well as taking a very rigorous critical approach to Kabbalah and not taking it at face value, Scholem took mysticism very, very seriously. The fact that the text needed critical analysis didn't detract from them as a source of religious value. And his basic theory of mysticism of Jewish mysticism was like that. Scholem believed that Judaism has passed through three phases. The first phase is the mythical phase, as we find recorded in the Bible. And that was a phase when people experienced God as being immediately present to them. And if we think about the relationship between God and Adam and Eve, God and Abraham, and Sarah, God and Moses, for example, we can see that that's a time when people really considered God to be present in their lives and immediately accessible. The second phase, Scholem called the classical phase, and that's marked by the idea of God as transcendent, God as being beyond or above the world and beyond our experience. And that's what's represented really in Rabbinic Judaism, where our only access to God is through reading the products of God's revelation in the Torah and through praying to God. But any kind of direct sense of God's presence has really vanished from the world. And it's precisely at that moment when God is entirely distant and transcendent that mysticism emerges. Because Scholem understands mysticism as an attempt to break through that gulf between human beings and God and reconnect to the divine. Now, that attempt to reconnect happens in a very particular way. So mysticism is not the same as philosophy, for example. So Jewish philosophy understands, for Scholem, understands religion as an allegory. So what we need to do is penetrate the allegorical stories of religion in order to get to the universal rational ideas about God that underlie them. I.e., we need to understand the stories and the rituals of religion to get through them, realize they're not really important. What's important are the rational ideas that are underneath, that actually we could access through philosophy if we wanted to. On the other hand, Gershom Scholem believes that mysticism understands religion not as a set of allegories, but as a set of symbols. And those symbols, which are the ideas and the stories and the rituals of Judaism, are like the tips of an iceberg, the tips of icebergs. They give us clues about a much bigger hidden reality that has to be understood and experienced on its own terms, and that can't be reduced into universal categories. It's particular to Judaism. And the final part of Jewish mysticism, which Scholem believed was unique, is that Jewish mysticism specifically has to be explored through the interpretation of religious texts. So our mysticism is not only religious, it's also specifically Jewish because it emerges from our Jewish texts and a particular way that we have to read them. With that, I'll say Chag Pesach Sameach or Shabbat Shalom or whenever you happen to be watching this, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this series.